Happy Wednesday, or is it today? Tuesday. Jesus, can you tell what day I want it to be? Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Carrison, and I'm an assistant professor in UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. And on behalf of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, I am so excited to welcome you to this afternoon's Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration Colloquium. So established in 1919 as the Bureau of Public Administration, the Institute of Governmental Studies, or IGS, is one of the oldest organized research units on the Berkeley campus. IGS has a history and perspective that's unique to California, yet its reach and influence stretches across the nation as well as around the globe. IGS also sits at the forefront of research, teaching, and service in California, as well as in American politics and policy. It boasts an interdisciplinary and nonpartisan agenda and engages faculty, research, and political practitioners to make a difference in discourse as well as practice. Its mission is anchored by a belief in the transformational power of public service. This colloquium, housed by IGS, the Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration series, invites speakers from the Berkeley campus, as well as other institutions, to share research touching on various aspects of race, ethnicity, and immigration. One important theme explored by the colloquium is the changing shape of ethnic politics in the country. A second closely related theme is the impact of immigration on the nation and on California's political and economic life specifically. Colloquium speakers offer a wealth of knowledge that stands to shape the current civil rights revolution and present important implications for public opinion, electoral outcomes, and government policy. It is my supreme pleasure to serve as this year's REI Program Director and to introduce you to our guest speaker. Anthony Ocampo is an associate professor of sociology at Cal Poly Pomona. Dr. Ocampo teaches classes on race and ethnicity, immigration, gender and sexuality, and statistics. He received his bachelor's in comparative studies in race and ethnicity, as well as his master's in modern thought and literature from Stanford University, and he earned a master's degree and PhD in sociology from UCLA. He's a native of Eagle Rock in Northeast Los Angeles, but has very deep roots in our Cal community. He's the author of the book, The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race, which chronicles the lives of Filipino American young adults growing up in Los Angeles, California. This work was even recently featured on NPR Morning Edition, and he's currently working on his second book, To Be Brown and Gay in LA, which chronicles the lives of gay men of color from immigrant families. And we are in for a treat because we're going to get a sneak peek into that work today. So please feel welcomed to turn off your video, mute yourself, but turn on your video, turn on your cameras. Raise your hand when you want to ask a question when we get to the Q&A section. And if you're chomping at the bit until then, please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat function in Zoom. You're also welcome to engage with us via Twitter. I promise I will read every single thing that you have to say, and we just love to hear your thoughts and comments and what's useful and what you learn from this experience. So I'm going to pull rank and actually ask a few questions following Anthony's talk. But after that, I'll turn everything over to you. And we're really welcoming you and encouraging you to engage following the talk. So with that, brilliant Dr. Anthony Ocampo, I turn it over to you with gratitude and big love and welcome.
Thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate, there, I can share my screen.
Yeah, your turn.
Yay. Okay. Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry, the sun is blaring in. I'm in North and East Richmond, also Wichino-Lene, unceded territory, and it's hot in this room. So I look more glorious than I really am. That's what's happening.
Okay, let me just get my life together and make sure I can share this PowerPoint, which we just tried like 5 minutes ago.
It's gonna work again because it has to.
It'll work again. It'll work again.
Is that Avea, G-Money? Who did I just see? Sorry, I'm obsessed with Christina's kids. Christina
No
Moore is one
problem.
of the co-directors of IGS.
Hi,
The babies are
Christina.
delicious. Mwah,
Nice to have
Bea.
you here. Thank you for coming. Well, everybody involved in planning this talk, especially Aaron, I really appreciate you. Aaron, you can hear me, yes? Thumbs up. Okay. Yeah, I just really appreciate the opportunity to do this because as we all know from 2020, community and intellectual community has been hard to come by, and given that we're all so strapped for time and labor and what summer break, it's just been wonderful to have little moments like this where I can be with my people and just talk ideas, and go engage in some dialogue about something that for me is super super important. So I just want to let folks know again, this is part of a larger book project that I've submitted, just waiting for the reviews from NYU Press. And as Aaron mentioned in a nutshell, it's a book that chronicles the experiences of young Latinx and Filipino American queer men, what it's like for them growing up in their family, what it's like growing up in their ethnic community, what it's like for them in school, from middle school to high school, in college, and what the experience is like becoming part of the larger LGBTQ community. And here I'm specifically focused in the region of Southern California. But at the heart of the book, what I'm really trying to explore is the way in which these young men negotiate their ethnic and racial identity vis-a-vis an emerging queer identity. And what I'm hoping for is that as folks read the book, they'll eventually get a sense and learn to appreciate all the choreography, all the mental gymnastics, all the labor that these young men endure as queer folks of color across a variety of different social contexts and different chapters of their lives just to be. Um, I love this quote from Imani Perry in her recent book Breathe, where she asked the question, how do folks become in a world that's just bent on them not becoming? And so for me, that quote is very much an anchor to this driving force of how I ended up writing this book. So yeah, the book's all about shining a light on all the cognitive and literal work that queer sons of immigrants do, not just to survive, but also to form community, build connection, and just navigate institutional spaces that were not designed with them in mind. I do want to say a little bit of how I came into this research because as a queer person of color, I think that it's just super important to share that. When I was training for my in sociology to become a sociologist at UCLA, I want to be an expert in race and immigration. And specifically what the group that I was interested in was children of immigrants, or the immigrant second generation, who, as everyone knows, are folks who were born in the US or migrated to the US at a very young age, but have at least one parent who was born in some other country. And in grad school, I was very much inspired by the seminal piece that was written in the early 90s by my advisor, Min Cho, and her colleague, Alejandro Cortez, entitled "This New Second Generation Segmented Assimilation and Its Variants." And for those that are less familiar with the research on immigration, before this article was written, it's important to note that there was this consensus among immigration scholars that immigrants and their children, with each passing generation, would eventually become incorporated into some middle-class American mainstream. And to some extent, this made sense considering that much of these studies were based on early waves of immigration from European societies, who were, these were folks that were racially and legally defined as white. And so the idea was that children and grandchildren of immigrants would lose their accents, would be less in touch with their ethnic culture, and eventually become unhyphenated Americans. And then, of course, we know that the literal face of immigration changed after 1965. And this is something that Cortez and Joe wanted to address. And so, whereas previous waves of immigration were coming from Europe, post 1965, after the Immigration Act of 65, the vast majority of new immigrants were coming from Latin America, Asia, and these were folks who, no matter their level of English proficiency or cultural assimilation, as we know from the year of 2020, they would never become white in the same way as European folks of yesteryear because of race. And so, building off this this new trend, segmented assimilation scholars push this new idea that assimilation of immigrants, or the incorporation of immigrants, would be a process that was segmented. So in other words, instead of becoming some part of some like mystic middle class American mainstream, they'd instead be incorporated to very different and unequal segments of society in terms of the neighborhoods that they lived in terms of education, in terms of the jobs they got, in terms of their socioeconomic status in this country. And so, as a grad student reading this, this theory was a big deal. And what I, came to learn with the emergence of Google Scholar is that it ended up inspiring thousands of studies that examine the key variables that would affect like which segment of society immigrants and their children would eventually become incorporated into. So there have been books and articles and policy studies that have demonstrated how things like race, language, neighborhood choice, parents, occupation, how these things affect education, social outcomes, life trajectories for children of immigrants. The thing is, as I was working on my PhD, this was in the 2000s. This was a period of my own life where I was coming into my own queer sexuality. And so when I juxtaposed like grad school life and like my real life, I started to notice something really revealing. So, when I was in grad school, I spent I went to UCLA. So it was a hop, skip, and a jump from West Hollywood, California, which folks may know is like the gay, like a gayborhood, like the major gayborhood in Southern California. And so I was involved in a lot of LA gay scenes and, that catered particularly to queer folks of color. And even in the middle of grad school, in one of my methods classes, I conducted an ethnography of gay Latinx clubs in LA, where I got to meet a lot of young folks of color who were children of immigrants themselves, but who also happened to identify as gay, bisexual, or queer. And fascinatingly, like amidst trying to learn the research on the immigrant second generation, one thing I noticed is that I very, very, actually, I really didn't see anything about the way that sexuality, and here I'm talking about sexuality in terms of like queer identity, affected the life outcomes of children of immigrants. And so I want to start today's talk by narrating the story of Armando Garza, who's a second generation Mexican American who grew up in El Monte, California, which is just east of downtown. For those who are unfamiliar with El Monte, it's like a mixed income, predominantly Latinx and some Asian American neighborhood, about like a 20-minute drive from downtown LA. And I start with Armando because I think his story really showcases a major limitation in the existing frameworks of the second generation. So Armando, he's the second youngest of four sons from a working class Mexican family. He grew up in a single income household where his father was the only parent who worked outside the home. He worked in construction. Both of Armando's parents migrated from rural towns in Mexico, and both had less than a high school education. Armando grew up in a household where domestic violence was a prevalent issue, and one of his older brothers happened to be in the local gang. In terms of the neighborhood context, Armando's surroundings were predominantly Latinx. About 3 out of every 4 residents was Latinx, and a little less than 20% was Asian American. And El Monte was a neighborhood where the median income was less than both the regional and state average, about $40,000 a year. In terms of the educational context of El Monte, it's a place where based on census data, very few residents hold a college degree. In fact, it's just about 1 in 5 less than 10% of residents hold a college degree. And there's also a large contingent of the population that has less than a high school degree, about 1 in 5 folks, which suggests that, for Armando, there wasn't really easy access to peers or older folks who are familiar with higher education. El Monte is a place that has had its fair share of trouble with gang violence. If you Google El Monte and read about it in the news, there's sporadically stories about gang violence in this neighborhood. And this was something that when I interviewed not just Armando, but other respondents who happened to be from the same neighborhood as him, this is something that was mentioned time and time again. In terms of the school context, Armando, he attended a public school in El Monte where the demographics very much mirrored the surrounding neighborhood. and 86% of students were Latinx, and most of the remaining folks were Asian American. And this was a context where school officials, teachers, again, based on the narratives of folks that went to the school, they didn't really expect much from their Latinx, particularly Latino male students. And Latino male students in this environment were often racialized as underachieving, or were stereotyped as troublemakers or even gang affiliated, even if they weren't. So, according to, you know, this segmented assimilation framework, these contextual factors, along with demographic factors like race and gender, these are the key factors that affect life trajectories of children of immigrants. So, for example, living in a middle-class family in a nice neighborhood where you attend a well-resourced public school would, according to the framework, predict positive educational outcomes. And, living within the type of social context that Armando lived in would project a downward pathway, so to speak. Subpar grades, low educational ambitions, increased risk for dropping out or falling into illicit activities like gangs or drugs. So, given the factors that were at play in Armando's life, you might be wondering what happened. And well, as it turned out, even with these contextual factors, Armando eventually made it to college, and not just any college. As we were talking, I learned that Armando after high school made his way to Georgetown University, which we know is one of the most selective universities in the country. And what became clear in the course of our conversation was that a missing variable that came into play was sexuality. This was a variable that very much influenced so many things about his educational pathway. And later on in the talk, I'm going to come back to Armando to talk about how exactly sexuality influenced his school experiences and other, as well as other men that I label as part of the quote, gay second generation. So in my study about the gay second generation, what I'm trying to show is that race, gender, and sexuality interact together to shape the everyday lives of queer children of immigrants. And for today, I'm going to focus on how the interplay of race, gender, and what I mean by gender, I mean like gender presentation, and sexuality affect the educational experiences of Latinx and Filipino American queer male youth in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do with this talk is show that the survival strategies that queer sons of immigrants have access to are very much shaped by race. So what's interesting about this particular group of young men that I studied is that this is a group that exists at the intersection of four of the most talked about issues of our day: immigration, race, gender, and gay rights. And in fields like education and sociology, when I was combing through the research, it's very clear that there's been this explosion of research on LGBTQ students and an explosion of research on children of immigrants, respectively. However, when it came to folks who embodied the identities that the young men in my study were, this was a population that was very much not spoken about in both LGBTQ and immigration research. So if you were to read Legacies or Immigrant America or that edited volume Ethnicities by Portes and Rumbaut, do your best to read something about someone being queer or gay or trans, and it's pretty much absent. And as a sociologist, I'm interested in why is it the case that there's this gap in the research? On a perfect, in terms of the racialized and gendered and heteronormative landscape of knowledge production. What's going on? Why are queer boys of color, particularly Latinx and Asian American boys, not included in these booming areas of research? One thing I noticed was that it had to do with the framing. So when you look at the body of literature on LGBTQ students, it overwhelmingly focuses on bullying and school climate issues, which makes sense given that there's been this, at the time when I started this, there's this national spotlight on queer children, queer teenagers who die from suicide, and countless others who suffer from depression or suicidal ideation. Meanwhile, in the field of immigration, when you look at educational studies, most of them focus on this race and the achievement gap between Latinx students and Asian American students. And so just the framing, the ways in which these two topics are generally addressed in terms of queer stuff and education, and students of color in education, the frame of conversation is just different. A second challenge has to do with recruitment. So research on LGBTQ students, such as this biannual school climate survey conducted by GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. These are findings and studies that are based on samples where the majority of respondents are white. So if in the rare times that these studies and their findings address race issues, they often lump queer students of color together as a monolith, as if the experience of being like a gay Black young woman is equivalent to the experience of being like a Latinx or Asian American trans man who's bisexual, right? And so even in studies that happen, like when I was the GLSEN studies, there's like one every year, and if you have the chance to Google them and download these very, very long reports, you'll notice that there's like 200 pages worth of tables and findings, and then like 3 pages of stuff addressing race and ethnicity for the larger report. And so like combing through the existing data, even in studies that happen to include a decent number of queer students of color, there's a data set called the California Healthy Kids Survey, for example. And of course, given that it's based in California, there's a lot of students of color that are included in the sample. But when you actually like break down the sample, you'll find that most of the respondents who are respondents of color happen to be queer women. And this makes sense given that queer men are, at least at the time of when these research studies were conducted, they're less likely than queer women to be out during middle school and high school. And even if they are out, there is like limitations about whether they would disclose sexual identity on a survey, even if it was anonymous. And thinking about like immigration data sets, I mean, the most popular ones are for the immigrant second generation are the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study, which is that data set by Portes and Rumbaut based off San Diego and Florida, Southern Florida. And then more recently, the IMLA study, which is the Immigrant Intergenerational and Metropolitan Los Angeles survey. This was based on like second generation folks in Southern California. They've been super important data sets when it comes to helping sociologists understand the trajectories of children of immigrants. In fact, a lot of our frameworks about the second generation are based on the SILS data set. There's like edited volumes and books that are published off of this. But when combing through the survey and the instrument, you'll find that sexual identity, or even any way to measure a proxy for sexual identity, is absent from the survey instrument, which means that there's actually no way to analyze how sexuality or related variables like gender presentation or being gender non-binary, there's no way to examine how those variables affect the life outcomes of the second generation. So what this means is that queer sons of immigrants exists in sort of this like invisible part like of both like sexuality research and immigration research. Of course, there's more to this research than just telling like an undertold story there's more than just like correcting, right? Of course, this project's about filling gaps in the research, but at a deeper level, it's showing like what new knowledge can emerge about educational inequality, at least in this talk, educational inequality. What new knowledge can emerge when researchers shine a light on the experiences of a group that's been totally overlooked, like queer students of color? So the narratives of queer students of color, what I realized is that in doing the interviews, is that they reveal a lot of information about the way educational spaces at both an institutional level and an interactional level are racialized, they're gendered, and heteronormative in practice. And so I know, I've given this talk in many different places, not just like academic environments, but I still encounter some folks, audiences, where they really do see school as this like great equalizer to help mitigate inequality. But as sociologists have shown time and time again, schools are fields of power relations. They're sites in which both the material capital and symbolic capital, everything from educational resources to respect and rapport from teachers to social status among classmates. These are things that are unevenly distributed to different sets of students based on race, class, gender, and sexuality. So in other words, schools are arenas in which social inequalities most likely become exacerbated and not minimized. And so in this respect, I kind of saw doing a study of second generation queer male youth, especially since I was doing it in the with a comparative approach. Again, it had the potential to reveal a lot about how schools are racialized, how schools are gendered, how schools are heteronormative, both at the institutional level and interactional level. And in case you're wondering why I decided to interview Latino and Filipino American respondents, one reason was that I felt that they had comparable experiences when it came to growing up gay in an immigrant family, especially because a large contingent of them are raised within culturally Catholic or practicing Catholic contexts. But as we know from research, they experience school very differently because how they are racialized and because of their perceived socioeconomic standing of their respective groups. So for the duration of today's talk, what I want to do is focus on a question, which is how do race and sexuality affect the educational experiences of Latino and Filipino American queer male youth? And to address this question, I conducted 7 structured interviews with 63 queer sons of immigrants. In the sample, there were 28 Mexican Americans, 28 Filipino Americans, and the remainder were folks who identified as some other Latinx ethnicity, such as Cuban, Salvadoran, Nicaraguan. Interviews lasted anywhere from 75 minutes to up to 3 hours. And at the time of the interviews, which were conducted in like circa 2011 to 2000, last one was in 2016, the respondents' ages were between 18 and 33. In terms of the socioeconomic status and educational attainment of respondents, it was mixed. I mean, we had folks that identified as being in different SES stratas. Half of them identified as about like middle class, about a quarter low SES. I have a table at the end that I can always show folks if folks are interested. But so folks were pretty diverse in terms of socioeconomics. But one thing I did notice is that the sample leaned toward higher education or like education aspiring folks. So a lot of folks were either finished with college or en route to finishing their bachelor's, and after the interview finished their bachelor's. So recruitment is for those interested in studying queer folks of color, queer youth of color. Recruitment is an important topic to discuss because traditionally it's been pretty hard to recruit queer students of color due to lack of access or the inability to gain rapport with this population. So, immigration researchers, with few exceptions, have seldom proactively sought out respondents who are queer. And so in order to recruit respondents, I relied on methods that have been documented by queer researchers like the late Lionel Cantu, and more. So I went to ethnic specific and mainstream gay social events in West Hollywood, East Hollywood, downtown LA, Silver Lake. I recruited folks from larger gay pride events, public gay pride events. I recruited folks from student organizations because sometimes queer folks of color in student organizations aren't necessarily involved in, say, like the city life of gay, the queer city life. And I also wanted to include folks who were may not necessarily be involved in like public spaces that are public queer spaces. And so I also did a little bit of snowball sampling. And so as research studies by like Mignon Moore and Lionel Cantu suggest, my ability to build rapport was very much facilitated by my being queer, my being a second generation Filipino American. It was interesting how like knowledge about the landscape of LA queer life was like um, the street cred I needed to get folks to agree to be interviewed. Just a little bit of background on these folks. Out of the 60 plus folks that I interviewed, only 10 said that they were out during high school. I think if we were to do the study like nowadays, it would be a little bit different, obviously, because the landscape of LGBTQ identity has changed in the US. But for these folks that were born 80s, early 90s, some late 70s, only 10 said that they were out during high school. And out of these 10, only 2 said that they were out to at least one teacher at their school. When I asked men about whether, like, which one of their identities, mattered more, on like a post-interview survey, 75% said that ethnic and racial identity and sexual identity were equally important, and 60% of them had said they experienced some sort of discrimination due to both ethnicity, race slash, as well as their sexuality. And so what this means is that studies that solely focus on race, or studies that only look at gender or only look at sexuality, are limited in their capacity to explain what everyday life is like in schools for folks like the queer men that I interviewed in this study. So now the fun part, the findings. There's been good amount of evidence that has pointed, as folks may feel or observe, there's been a greater acceptance of gay people in society. I mean, we obviously have like same-sex marriage. There's a greater representation of queer characters on television and media. We have Elliot Page, who is the star of Juno, come out on Twitter, and for the most part, people are very come out as trans on Twitter, and people are like super celebratory about that. And even when you look at things like the General Social Survey or the Pew Research Center data, it's clear that like acceptance of queer people is shifting, and it's shifting very quickly in this country. And even in the context of schools specifically, we've seen that there's a decline in anti-gay language in schools. So kids are less likely nowadays to say phrases like "that's so gay." We've seen a decline in harassment of gay students, verbal harassment, as well as physical harassment. And increasingly, there's more and more support for gay and other queer students at schools. There's been a decent rise in the number of gay straight alliances, which are like high school clubs that are supposed to be supportive of gay students and straight allies. And we've also seen an increase in the presence of queer-friendly teachers and staff at schools. But even so, if there's anything that we know from research of sociologists who study social movements or scholars who study intersectionality, we know that social progress doesn't affect all members of marginalized groups equally. So this is apparent when we think about the experiences of Black women and Black queer people during the civil rights movement. It's apparent when we think of women of color and mainstream feminism, mainstream white feminism. It's apparent when we think of people of color within the larger gay rights movement, or trans women of color within the larger LGBTQ rights movement. And so it wasn't too surprising to me that when I actually got to talking to respondents, the vast majority of them said that they had zero social support in school. And I'm talking middle school and high school, zero social support in school when it came to being gay. And even if they attended a school where resources were readily available, I found that they weren't necessarily the first ones in line to take advantage of those resources. And when thinking about what they were telling me, there were a number of reasons that it came down to for why they didn't feel supported and they didn't seek resources out in their schools. Some said they didn't want to go to the Gay Straight Alliance or talk to the teacher who was a queer ally because it might lead others to suspect that they might be gay themselves. It might out them. In addition to that fear of being outed, race is a very prevalent frame with which people spoke. So Latino students talked about the way in which Latino boys were typecast and stereotyped, which didn't necessarily provide the best atmosphere for them to confide in teachers. For Filipinos, race was also coming into play, but it was coming into play in a different way, in the sense that A lot of Filipinos were typecast, not in a negative fashion, but with more positive stereotypes, if you will. They were racialized as a model minority group. And for them, there was this like idea that model minority students aren't supposed to have problems, or if they do, it's expected that they'll just like figure it out on their own quietly without any help. Of course, it was still the case that respondents encountered teachers who were, who were homophobic or complicit with homophobia whenever homophobic or transphobic comments were said out loud. And you know, the other way in which race came into play was that some respondents framed like gay student clubs as like a white thing, or some framed coming out as like a white thing, because it's like they had this idea that like students of color don't have the same freedoms or liberty to come out as queer. They can't just do what they want, unlike the white queer kids, who, you know, whether that was a true narrative or not, that was the way that respondents were framing it, is that like the white queer kids can do whatever they want, their parents don't care. For us, like children of immigrants, we have like impressions to manage, not just with our families, but our ethnic community and even like the home country for some folks. And so in the absence, in like the complete absence of any social support around sexuality, what did my respondents do to survive school? Well, what I found was that they engaged in, you know, I remember reading this from a memoir by Kevin Yish, I forgot the last, I'm going to mispronounce the name, but a Japanese American law professor at Yale turned me to this idea of covering as it pertains to queer men of color. And I observed this very much so with respondents, is that they were engaged in what Irving Goffman, who's the original person that came up with this, defined as covering. So I'm just going to read a quote from the very, very short study, Stigma, where Irving Goffman writes, "It's a fact that persons who are ready to admit possession of a stigma, in many cases because it is known about or immediately apparent, may nonetheless make a great effort to keep the stigma from looming large. This process will be referred to as covering." So to be clear, covering for respondents, and of course, like the respondents weren't saying the words I was engaging in covering. Obviously, that's my like sociological descriptor for it. But to be clear, for a lot of young men, covering wasn't about trying to pass as heterosexual. So by this time, most of my respondents, they like, this is where I think like queer men and queer, there's differences in queer men and queer women, is that a lot of my respondents sort of had the narrative of like, I knew early on that I was different or I was queer or gay. Whereas with the experience of queer women, you know, the moment in which they come into that identity, it's a broader range of ages. Anyway, most respondents knew, at least themselves, even if they never told anyone that they, like outwardly, they knew that they weren't heterosexual. And so covering for them was about front loading some other aspect of one's identity in such a way that it deflected conversations around one's queerness or suspected queerness. And there are a number of ways, by the way, that men engaged in covering. Some joined sports, others joined band. There was an unusual high number of those that joined student government and student council. As one respondent put it, like, gay men love leadership opportunities or leadership positions. Yeah, there were a lot of ways in which young men were covering. But today, what I want to focus on is just one type of covering that was very, very prevalent among the queer men that I interviewed, both Filipino and Latinx. And that's something that in the book I write about as academic covering. So academic covering was about creating this like schoolboy persona. It was this strategy of investing in the educational game as a way to deflect attention away from one's queer sexuality. So in the context of school, it was a pragmatic survival strategy. For some, it was a way to evade harassment from other boys. So I remember Armando, who's the respondent I mentioned earlier, he said that for him, it was like super important. Like it was like necessary that he be in honors and advanced placement classes in high school, because he said those were places where he felt safer. He said in my regular classes, in classes like PE, Other boys were like always questioning my masculinity. But in my AP and honors classes, which when I asked them to describe them, they were predominantly mostly like majority women classes. Armando said it wasn't my masculinity that mattered. It was more about how smart I was. And so, you know, the context, academic context, even within the same school, could define like the currency that matters. And that was something that these young men were very privy to. Academic covering obviously had a lot of function beyond school. Within the immigrant family, doing well in school was like a way for them to win back points that they lose if their parents were to discover that they were gay, or if their parents were suspecting that they're already suspecting that they were queer. And as one respondent put it, he said, if I can't be the football son that my dad wanted, I can at least be the smart son. Some used academics as a way to deflect awkward conversations with extended family at social gatherings. They'd say things like, you know, if like relatives were like, oh, why don't you have a girlfriend yet? They would say like, I'm focusing on my studies. And it was an excuse that would help shut down like the nosy auntie or cousin that's asking why aren't they dating yet? And in fact, it wasn't just respondents who used it. It was also their parents who used it too, whether they knew that their kid was queer or not at that point. So I focus on academic covering in this talk because it reveals the way that covering strategies of young men are influenced by race. And so for the remainder of the presentation, I want to focus on 3 key respondents. 1 Filipino American and 2 Mexican American, all of whom come from working class or low income households. And part of the reason I'm focusing on these 3 respondents is because I'm kind of like controlling for class here. As a way to underscore how much race really shaped the survival strategies that were available to queer young men of color in school. So let me start with the Filipino American respondent. Before I talk about the specific respondent, I just want to give an overview of like the Filipino queer male patterns that I observed. In my interviews, what became really obvious was that the academic covering was a strategy that was readily available to Filipino respondents. So the majority of Filipinos that I spoke with said they engaged in some form of academic covering during middle school and in high school. So middle school is like where you start having academic tracking like GATE, gifted and talented education, as well as, and then in high school you have like programs like AVID and but like honors and AP and international baccalaureate. So, but a lot of these Filipinos said that the academic covering started in middle school, which was a time that also coincided with the chapter of life where young men are expected to literally demonstrate their heterosexuality. You know, that's when school dances start. That's when people start really like hooking up with people and talking about it. It's that I think there was a reason why it started at that middle school age, and it was clear from their narratives that race played a role, specifically the way in which Filipino respondents understood the way teachers, school officials, and even other classmates saw them. And what's funny is that, you know, I interviewed, my study recruitment process got folks that were, a lot of whom were raised in Southern California, but also other folks that happened to grow up in like San Diego, the Bay Area, the Central Valley, New Jersey. One was from Connecticut. And one thing was clear. Is that like when folks describe the racial context of their high school or like the way in which their high school is organized, it was remarkably similar when it came to the way they talked about Filipinos and Asian Americans. So for example, like Filipinos and Asians comprise the majority of honors in AP, Black and Latinx students comprise the majority of the regular track. And it was even the story for Filipinos that I interviewed, like no matter what part of the country they happened to go to school in. And so the first of the 3 respondents I want to talk about is Franklin Flores, who, even though he didn't have the best grades, even though his life could be considered at risk, he struggled with housing security, struggled with economically struggled. He was someone who benefited from something that sociologist Jennifer Lee and Minjo defined as stereotype promise. So Let me just skip over this. So Franklin, he was someone who benefited from stereotype promise and thus was able to engage in academic covering in high school. Um, again, he was someone that like struggled economically, financially, housing wise in middle school, but everything turned around when he was in high school. He said that school provided the structure and stability that didn't exist in his family life. Even though he was in an economic and domestic situation that was extremely precarious, his teachers never once labeled him as, quote, at risk, or never thought he was in danger of, say, dropping out of school. And in our interview, he talked about moments when his race, being like one of the few Filipino / Asian American students at a predominantly Black and Latinx school, it seemed to catapult his standing in the eyes of teachers who assumed that he was from like the more wealthy part of the surrounding city, unlike the Black and Latinx students, even though he had like gone to school with them from K through 8 that whole time. And so Franklin, when I interviewed him about his experience, he said, like, I was Asian, and so they saw me as model minority. They not only assumed I was smart, they also assumed I was rich and from a good family. And of course, at the time he's like happy. This was before he like went to college and realized how messed up this was. He was happy to be extended these opportunities, but he also noticed how none of these same opportunities were ever extended to Black and Latinx classmates he'd spent pretty much all his schooling life with, even though those folks were from like economically better situations or had more stable families than his own. And so the reason I bring this up is because the way in which Franklin was framed or understood vis-a-vis his other classmates led to a cascade of other support systems that didn't necessarily have to do with his sexuality, but had to do with like him being seen as a good student. Teachers invested in him. They went above and beyond to like try to help him with like going to college. At some point, he developed such a rapport with them that it actually emboldened him to start engaging in gender play. Like he would cross dress in high school, even though he didn't come out as queer. He would cross dress in high school, and I asked him like, "Aren't you worried that folks are going to care?" He's like, "No, I don't give a shit because I know that my teachers have my back. I always have their support." Of course, it was never explicitly linked to his sexuality, but the fact that he was seen as like one of the chosen students at his school made him more emboldened him to play around with gender and sexuality in a very public way. I do know that we're running at the top of the hour, and so if you don't mind, I'm actually going to skip a little bit to one of the middle respondents, and I can talk about them in the Q&A, but I do want to talk about the patterns and how they differ for Latinx queer male youth. So what was different for the Latino respondents that I interviewed was that, of course, as one might expect, there were just proportion-wise, there were a smaller percentage of Latino respondents engaged in academic covering. But still a good number of them did, about half of them did, as compared to say like the vast majority of Filipinos that I interviewed. And so when I looked at Latino respondents and how they arrived at the strategy, it became very clear that their pathway to academic covering was very different from Filipinos. So unlike the case for Filipinos where like the gates of education opportunity were flung open to them by virtue of this positive racial stereotyping, for Latinos, there had to be a constellation of factors in place for them to engage in academic covering. So first off, they had to have attended a school that was like overwhelmingly majority Latinx. I'm talking like 85 to 90% of the students are Latinx. In schools where the Latinx student population was smaller, even if Latinos were still the majority, it was often the case that the tracking system would relegate most Latino students to, quote, the regular and remedial tracks. And this was, of course, more prevalent among boys than women. But at predominantly Latinx schools, there had to be by default like a decent representation of Latinx students in the honors and AP tracks, as well as in middle school, like the GATE track. Second, among the Latinos that engaged in academic covering, all of them spoke about having a teacher. a cultural guardian, what sociologist Glenda Flores calls a cultural guardian. This was teacher, often a teacher of color, very often a Latina teacher who help not only cultivate their academic potential, but also help them navigate racially charged situations that could have blocked their educational trajectories. So these were the kind of teachers that volunteered to give respondents rides before and after school. These are the ones who would like offer their own money to buy them supplies, or pay for extracurricular activities or college applications. These were the teachers that like took it upon themselves to interact with immigrant parents when immigrant parents were, say, like reticent about educational opportunities, like upward bound or like a college tours. These teachers would sort of like broker the situation for them, and sometimes they do this in both English and Spanish. And what became evident was that Latino respondents, like the other thing that happened here was that there was a sort of like presentation of self thing happening as well, where I, from the narratives of respondents who engaged in academic covering, Latino respondents, there was this like implicit way in which they would frame themselves as like in school they were the good Latino boy, or like the exceptional Latino. And sometimes this went as far as like maintaining presentation of self styles or like musical tastes that were distinct, like that demarcated them from the typical Latino boy on campus. So all of these factors came into play. Going back to our original respondent, Armando, it came into play in his life where, oops, sorry. Go back. He was able to engage in academic covering. So again, his family is working class. He didn't grow up in the best of neighborhoods. Almonte is interesting because like certain parts like look very like they look like, he described his neighborhood as looking like the Wonder Years, but then like one block away there was like shootings. It's I don't know if that's a very LA thing, but yeah, it had that sort of environment that didn't necessarily feel safe, one where he could often get into trouble. But one detail that I didn't mention earlier was that, he grew up in a household, he was one of four boys, and he had a older brother who constantly berated him about why he didn't act like a boy, or why he walked like a fag, or why he talked like a girl, why he didn't like sports, why he was like terrible at running, why did he walk like his brother, that was sort of would have been the ambassador to some of the like stereotypical Latino male influences in that context. It was his like it was Armando's gender transgressions that essentially like nipped that in the bud. But it was also very traumatizing for him as well. And for Armando, school, because of this harassment he was facing at home from his brother, he said school was my way out of that madhouse. And so while Armando brothers would go to soccer or baseball practice, Armando would tell his mom that he would like have homework to do, and but really he was like, he wanted to go do homework because it just gave him an excuse to be away from an older brother who was harassing him for being like effeminate or perceiving him as gay. And so his mom would actually like drive him to the library, and she'd wait in the parking lot, sometimes as long as 4 hours long, while he did homework. And he said like school became a matter of daily survival. When he got to high school though, when he got to high school, something happened that happens to a lot of Latinx students, where no matter what their academic performance was prior to high school, they automatically get perceived as being like not deserving, or like should not be placed in like the rigorous classes at the school, even if like Latinos, again, in his high school, were the majority. And so this is what happened to him. Like he when he arrived at high school, he was automatically placed in regular tracks. He was relatively shy, so there was even some teachers that assumed he didn't speak English, even though English was his main language. And so, and then of course, when he was in these regular classes, he didn't really participate much in class because he didn't want to be subjected to the same sort of bullying he experienced at home. So in the first year of high school, he found himself like super disengaged, and the classes to him weren't rigorous enough. And so what ended up happening was that Armando, like, he ended up um, encountering one particular teacher, and I call her in the book Miss Trujillo, who herself was Mexican American, who was able to see past what was going on. Um, he said, Mrs. Trujillo saw that I was bored and that I was figuring shit out on my own. She was like, "You are really smart and talented, and one day you're gonna go to USC." I don't know why she said USC, but she said USC. You need to. He didn't end up going to USC, as we know, but you need to be in the honors track, and you need to go to the counselor and tell him that you want to be signed up in honors anyway. So here's an example of how this cultural guardian, as Glenda Flores would call it, like intervened in Armando's behalf, like went above and beyond the call of duty to like literally shift the course of his educational trajectory, because she saw like that um, he wasn't like the other boys in his grade. So the thing about like academic covering high school, like, yes, it got Armando out of his madhouse. He was able to do things like Upward Bound. He did Upward Bound program and stayed a summer in the Bay Area at one of the colleges there. He spent a summer interning in Sacramento at the Capitol, and he got to like tour colleges on the East Coast, which is how he came to learn about Georgetown in the first place. But the thing about academic covering is that it came at a cost. Armando said like it created a rift between him and other Latino, particularly Latino male students in his class. He said, "I tended to identify more with the Asian kids than the Latino kids, especially when I went further in high school because I was in the honors track. No one really talked shit, but people always described me as the kid who was hanging out with all the Asians. I felt like there was something wrong with me because I had no Latino friends. I felt like I was Asian washed." And it's important to note here that the Asian friends that Armando had were almost all Asian American women. And it was interesting because like he spoke about experiences where he would, in high school you form study groups where his Asian American young women classmates, um, when he went to go to their houses to study, the parents of the Asian American, they're Asian, the parents of these Asian American women would be worried because Armando was Latino, and so they were afraid that their daughters would get pregnant. But the Asian American daughters had to tell their parents, "You don't have to worry about anything when it comes to Armando." Wink, wink. And so Armando's queerness or perceived queerness was what allowed him entree into like study groups that are so integral to academic success in high school. And so that, thinking about Armando's story and juxtaposing it to Franklin's story, they're both like happy ending stories on the surface, but they really underscore the limitations of academic covering. It's so obvious that like academic covering was not in any way institutionally transformative. So even if they individually were able to thrive and do well, their doing well did nothing to reshape the landscape for queer and trans students at their respective schools at all. Their ability to academically cover was predicated on their ability to capitalize on racial stereotypes. So for Asian Americans, like Franklin's ability to do model minority identity, or Armando's ability to like distance himself from like the typical Latino and be like the good Latino boy. That is like their strategies just reinforce the racial stereotypes that are so damaging on a wider level. And ultimately, what was really most tragic was that academic covering just reinforced the notion that acceptance in the context of school, as well as in the context of family, was conditional at best. And so last thing I'll say, because I know like I'm probably going over, is like, what's the implications for sociology? Well, the take home for sociology is that I want to show that the social organization of schools, they shape the meanings and values of identities, and identities in turn shape educational behaviors. In other parts of the book, though, I talk about how this intersection between race and sexuality, it changes across the chapter, the different social contexts and across the lifespan. So channeling the work of Roberto Gonzalez, who talked about how undocumented identity like has different implications across the lifespan. In my book, I wanted to show like a similar thing where like the interaction of ethnicity, race, and sexuality. They changed the process of social incorporation in different, depending on what stage we're talking about. And finally, with respect to like the broader like growing research on the immigrant second generation, I just wanted to like center the story on these young men because it really hits home how impactful sexual identity and gender presentation is, like gender is, but with respect to like gender presentation specifically is on the trajectories of immigrant second generation folks. And of course, like I'm only looking at cisgender Asian, like Filipino and Latinx men, but I mean, like while there are implications for like second generation Black Americans or second generation trans, intersex, non-binary folks, my hope is that this study gives at least a template or like a reinforces the importance of centering queerness when thinking about the way children and immigrants adapt to this country. So I'll pause there, and thank you for giving me the space to do this. I like your party
Yay!
emoji.
I'm so happy. Christina, I see your hand up. I just want to ask 1 second. So first of all, Anthony, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. That
Oh
was
shit.
wonderful. You're
Oh
good.
yeah,
You
I
want to
just saw your alert. I'm sorry. Oh
Oh, you're
no.
good. We
Okay.
got it. We got
Okay.
it.
Okay.
No worries. And if you'd like to unshare, you may, so we can just open
Okay.
up the
Yes.
screen.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So thank you so much for that. There's a lot of things I learned, particularly that everybody has a nosy auntie. And I want to lift up a couple of things that I think are really important nuggets that you gave us to think about before I ask a question really briefly. So first, I had never heard of an unhyphenated American, right? And the politics of inclusion and erasure that emerges a pretty unyielding tension. And what do we lose or gain by aspiring to that kind of classification? That's something I had never considered. And I really, really appreciate you also troubling the waters and the assumptions that are laid at the feet of traditionally, model minority groups. And lastly, thank you so much for naming your positionality and how it informs your research and for the better, right? As opposed to offering some kind of weird disclaimer, or liability disclosure. We need to stop doing that. So thank you, thank you. I have a brief question, and then I want to make sure we leave ample time for everyone else. Kind of a methodological construction question, if you will, because your sample of boys included Filipinos, but then you also had Mexicans, Cuban, and Salvadorians. And myself, I routinely and intentionally delineate the experience of Black folks, as distinct from beneath the larger umbrella of POC, if you will.
Mm-hmm,
So for
mm-hmm.
you, what is the significance? Assuming you're being really intentional about this, I want to learn. What is the significance of parceling out the sons of Filipino immigrants as distinct from other Asian Americans or even South Asian Americans, but not the sons of folks whose family origin spans Central and South America? Why group Latinx but parcel out?
Yeah. No, that's a really excellent question. And I I like I think about, well, I think it's like worth saying that I wrote a whole book about like why Filipinos should, like, in what ways are they demarcated from Asian Americans, and then here I am using like a panethic label. So it's like
Okay.
um you're right. And I think like when I think about the process of research, there was like there was a significant challenge to recruiting. Like, I wish I could go back in time and have done a more exhaustive sampling where I had Filipino, Mexican, and say like Salvadoran, because that was the largest of the other Latinx that I was countering. Because over time I started to observe some differences between like Mexican American respondents. I had some South American descent respondents, and then like folks from Central America, mostly Salvadoran. And I think about the ways in which, for example, some of the other Latinx ethnicities, like Cuban, Nicaraguan, some of them passed as white or were multiracial, and their experience coming into schools and other parts coming into the scene were affected by their non-Mexican status as well. So like, you know, there were there were whispers of among like Salvadoran respondents that were like, I always get Mexicanized, but I am very much not Mexican, and not be and me being not Mexicans, and this happens I think for older respondents more than younger ones. Older Salvadoran respondents were like, I feel boxed out of like the Latino student orgs
That's so
because
interesting.
you know, and so like I had a couple folks that were like, they went to Berkeley, funny enough, and we're like, I don't feel at home in like the queer, the pan ethnic queer Latin org, Latinx org. I actually find my queer space in UCL, which is the like Salvadoran student org, which was by like there was a ton. It was practically a queer organization. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I want to think about that because I do think like there is some intersection. There is something comparable about the way like Filipinos get Asianized and Salvadorans get Mexican.
Mhm.
Like there's like an erasure that's happening that has some parallels there.
Cool. Thank you. Christina was waiting, and I also just want to remind folks, please, if you want to raise your hand, if you go to participants at the bottom of your screen, I'm assuming if you're using a desktop, you can raise your hand, and then I will see it, or Kelly Jones, who's in the background, puppet mastering everything, will see it. And if you're on the phone, I think it's *9. It's either *9 or *6, one of the two, to raise your hand. We definitely want to hear from you. Christina, please.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Anthony. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
And yeah, it's so great to see this project sort of on its way out and done. And it's just so exciting. So the first part of your presentation took me back in not the most nicest way to my second year of grad school at Princeton, sitting in a search of immigration class with a professor that you might know or that you might be referencing. And so literally I went back, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm hearing these terms again. And so his voice is now in my head. And one thing that this professor might be saying is he always said things like what's necessary and sufficient, right? In order to make a case for sort of understanding what newness to his grand theory or whatever, something, what is necessary, sufficient. And so when I was hearing you present, it seemed that for the gay Latino students, right, it was really what sort of helped them get over the edge was the role of mentors, right? The role of mentors and a support system. And this isn't so different from what you find in segmented assimilation theory, right? When they sort of look at sort of what allows sort of those, mainly Latinos that they were looking at with this question, it was really the sort of role of mentor. So in my head, he would be arguing, he's like, so where is the role of sexuality if that's really the mechanism that's pushing them towards sort of this upward trajectory? So that's my first question. The second question, because I'm just going to pull a little rank, is how would you find this today? Or how long are your findings useful for this explanation? I've got a 5-year-old son, and, in 10 years, he'll be in high school. And as you know, gender politics are so dynamic and so changing. How long it's covering and sort of the academic persona do you think this will still be a main sort of route to understanding the adaptation of these populations?
Yeah. So I think that with the first question, this is where I think the lifespan, like tracking sexuality across the lifespan, provides some advantages because, and I'll refer to Armando specifically, where in his last year of his senior, the right before his senior year, um, right before his senior year, he had a conversation with himself and says, okay, I'm graduating. I could either move back to LA or I could stay in DC. But one thing I got to do is I got to tell my family about, at least tell my mom, who was like, you know, very close to his mom. Of the four sons, he was the favorite. He was the one engaged in language brokering with her, was super, super close, in part because like their time was organized together. The other three brothers were with the dad, sports, and, you know, he would be the one like going shopping with his mom. And so how do I know it's sexuality? Well, when he eventually mentioned to her that, you know, he is gay, he doesn't want to get married to a woman, mom's immediate reaction was, how could this be? I gave birth to a boy, not a girl. It immediately severed his emotional relationship with his mom. And, you know, this was someone, again, that had so invested in his academic life. So even at Georgetown, he had no shortage of mentors, professors, or colleague, or as with a lot of students of color, like the more advanced undergrad POCs. But it that moment shot him down a rabbit hole of like daily drug and alcohol use, daily illicit activities, sex, like in terms of like unsafe sex. It's just sort of like, he was like, what's the point of manufacturing anything? And I think that was, you know, that's one super obvious, like clear way where sexuality, that story in particular was a moment where I was like, wow, like this little fact, if revealed or disclosed, has the ability to just shatter or unravel one's social world. So that's like when you ask that first question, what I think about. And then how long this is going to be useful. Oh my gosh, Christina, I started this in 2011. I started thinking about doing this in 2011, and then the world changed from under us. Like we have like Grindr and same-sex marriage, and we have like a trans rights movement, even though of course we know that like Black trans, Latinx trans women are experiencing a lot of violence. But I struggled with this. I was like, is this even gonna have any utility? And I, somewhere amidst like starting to be public and share these findings, I will get emails or DMs on Twitter with folks that have that are much younger than me, so 20 years young or more than 20 years younger than me, that are still in secondary school, that has said that something about what they read in, or they saw a talk, or they like I mentioned something related to study, and they still could relate. So I do think that there are pockets in which, you know, I remember one younger respondent in particular happened to read the article version of something, and he said, I just came out to my mom, like we're like 20 years apart. So he's like, I just came out to my mom, but I saw your article, and I just came out to my mom, she didn't take it well. I saw your article, and then I started crying, and then I shared your article with my mom, and she started crying, and then we read it together, we started crying together. And so I in some ways I realize that it still has some resonance for the people who are my primary audience. And then number two, oh, I forgot, another motivation for wanting to do the study is because as I was doing it, I was getting more and more like folks that seemed to undermine like folks that were like, oh, now that we're all like in like pro gay in America, like they were treating great gay people as if they never experienced this trauma and just sort of erasing it. And so I wanted to like re-etch it like into the narrative too. So I do wonder though how the landscape's going to change. I do think that race is going to stay prevalent, and then more so than like queerness. So
And there's always going to be ugliness. So we need you speaking truth to power. Thank you for those questions,
yeah.
Christina. Catherine Choi has been patiently waiting. Please,
Oh,
Catherine.
hi.
Hi,
Hello.
it's nice to see you. Thank you for being here. And I also want to thank IGS for organizing this talk. My question has to do with, I'm curious from your research about the impact of immigrant heritage, immigrant culture on your respondents' understanding of sexuality.
Yeah.
So specifically with, when I think about Filipino Americans, and how might that second generation think about sexuality a bit differently than the way we traditionally understand quote unquote gay, in the sense that in the Philippines, the sexual identity of bakla has a very expansive, like flexible understanding of sexuality and gayness. And so I'm sort of interested in how your respondents were thinking about those ideas of sexuality.
Yeah, and that's like the central theme of the chapter that's previous to this one in the book. And it's it's I think about what makes me most sad about the way in which respondents understood Philippine sexuality, for example, is that there's just so much because queerness functioned as in a particular way in the home country. There's so much possibility there to show like transgression and acts of resistance, and so early on these young men understand bakla as caricatures, one-dimensional folks that might have some like relative.
Anthony, I'm sorry. Can you just really briefly define that?
Yes.
Thank you.
So in the Philippines, there's a term called bakla, which is generally used for gay and queer men, but it's all encompassing of sexual like behavior orientation as well as gender presentation. So someone who's bakla, like they don't demarcate, like bakla generally is a way to describe someone's gender transgressions, but it also has to do with orientation as well. So they saw like the bakla as like something they definitely like they wanted to avoid at any cost, because there was this like caricature, one-dimensional person that could be in the family, but it was always sort of like a running joke and a subject of gossip behind closed doors. And so like obviously when they were growing up, their parents would say like, don't act bakla, don't act like, which is like, don't act gay, don't act queer, don't, people might think you're bakla. And so there was this built-in like fear that was going on. This is where I think Christina's question is interesting, because because of the TikTok and because of the Instagram, I've witnessed this new relationship between queer Filipino Americans and queer Philippines, in the sense that like now that we're more open and not policing effeminate behavior among male identified folks, I've been noticing this like contingent of queer Filipino Americans that are like embracing the Philippine bakla. So for example, BL series, which is boy love series, which are like a phenomenon in Asia of like young men like falling in love, like rom-com, but like gay Filipino boys. They're like forming little like communities to like watch that together and converse about it. And that's something that's so different from the way they talked about what bakla meant in the in the early part of their lives, as something that they want to avoid at all costs. In fact, like the thing is like, oh mom, I'll be gay, but I won't be bakla, which is like, I'll be gay in the sense that I'll have a male partner, but I won't act like a girl. That was often the first thing that came out of these boys' mouths when they disclose their sexuality, is that I'm gonna be gay, but I'm not gonna be that kind of gay. Was the very like, reflex reaction a lot of these young Filipino men and Latinx men.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Karina Santayano has been waiting. Karina, are you still there? There you
Yeah,
are. And then I want time for one more. So if we can answer Karina's question, Anthony, and still have time for one more, it'd be great.
Yes.
Hi, Anthony. I can't wait to buy your book because it's such a fascinating project. I was struck by how some of the respondents talked about how school was like a safe place. And I think even, I mean, clearly I'm not an immigrant gay man, but I think for children, young adults who are coming from poorer backgrounds and there might be domestic violence or other kinds of violence at home, school is a safe place that does, put that routine in for them. And I was struck at that because not only did it resonate with me, but also I was thinking about all the literature that says that school polices students of color. And so I kind of want to hear your thoughts about that tension a bit more. And then the second question I had was, did any of the respondents talk about like their body in terms of how that played a role in their academic covering or just covering in general at home?
Yeah, so the answer to the second question is yes. There's certainly sections of the book where I talk about how like weight, like physical weight and build was tied to effeminate, like you read effeminate if you were a heavier boy growing up. And then there's, in the spirit of like avoiding certain paces where masculinity is the currency, this is like body definitely come into play, especially during that time. With respect to the other question about policing students of color, when that picture where I was talking about, that's not Armando, by the way, of course, because as sociologists we conceal identity. But Armando is someone who was very upfront about talking about his presentation of self. Like he's like, I had Asian hair. I used bleach and I kept it spiky. I watched Dragon Ball Z. I dressed in a particular way, and those were like distinct from, say, like at the time baggy pants, like Nike Cortezes, like lugs, Dickies and Ben Davis. Like those were things that he juxtaposed his presentation of self. And so in some ways, like the policing, when we think about policing of young men of color in schools, we associate dress with it. And in some ways, and I don't think he did this consciously, like it's not clear where he did this consciously or not, but he was like, you wouldn't mistake, like based off the picture he provided, he would be not that racialized brown boy in school. Like that's not how like you would draw a picture of it. So
Thank you so much. And thank you for that question, Karina. In the last minute that we have, because I don't see any other, damn it, hold on. Who's that, Jose? Jose, can you do it fast?
Actually, very.
And then Anthony, you got to answer fast. Go ahead, Jose. I want to make sure that folks have a chance to speak with our wonderful speaker. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just curious how these Latinx men identify. Did they actually identify as Latinx, or did they identify as first generation, second generation, Mexican American, Chicano, or and so on?
good question. So my dilemma is that I started this study at a time when none of these people would identify as Filipinx or Latinx. And so in the writing of the book, I'm like, oh, crap, what do I do? Because like they identify as I'm Mexican, I'm Nicaraguan, I'm Latino maybe, but never Latinx. So I wish I could talk to you for like 10 more minutes because I'm grappling with, so zero
Twitter.
of them identify.
Email and Twitter.
Yeah. Zero of them identify as Latinx, like zero. Based off their Facebooks or their Instagrams, if I happen to catch wind of them, I see that a handful of them are using Latinx or Filipinx. But it's interesting. Some of the Filipino respondents spell their with an F, some spell it with a P, some are like Filipinx, some are like identities are in flux. As soon as I wrapped up on studies, I started to observe their identifiers like all over the place on the socials. But I want to reach out to you because I want to have a longer conversation about what to do about the OX thing.
Yeah.
So
Send you a message on IG.
yes, wonderful.
Thanks, Jose, and thank you, Anthony. I want to be mindful of time because we're 1
Yes.
minute over. So do you want me to stop, Anthony, or may I ask you one more?
Yeah, ask me. I have time for one
I can
more.
do it quickly.
Yes,
So this
and we
is,
can always feel free to. You have my phone number. We can always.
I do. Well, I want to
Yeah.
make sure that other folks who want to stick around for a moment,
Yeah.
though, get a chance to hear your answer because I think it's important. Because of course I'm going to bring it back to IGS, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
for the children of Latinx and Asian immigrants who are navigating this weight and this legacy of segmented assimilation and emerging sexual and gender identities that are marginalized,
Mhm.
did they cite any specific pressures that they said shape their civic engagement or sense of belonging to the communities to which they'd like to belong, right? And what that means for their political priorities and opportunities for mobilization. That's a big, chunky, clunky question,
Mhm.
but we got to bring it back, to civic engagement.
Yeah.
And political mobilization. And the kind of momentum that folks can bring to these spaces, not in spite of, but because of their intersecting identities.
Exactly. Yeah. I have a whole college chapter where politics is front and center. But
Okay.
what's interesting is that you see this shift in 2008 with obviously there was the Prop 8 thing going on. You had a lot of folks that were talking about 2008 as like gay politics is so white, like like queer politics, queer public spaces, it is like super, super white and we don't belong. They ignore experiences. They don't account for things like, undocumented queer folks, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, post 2008, when I think that two things happened. Number one, queer, like thinking of the political terrain of college, queer college students that were the leaders for things like Mecha or the Filipino org, the men were overwhelmingly queer. And so there was like this thing where like, I don't know, of like being in student council translated to like wanting to be the president of Mecha or something, but like it was the norm for the ethnic student organizations to have leadership with a lot of queer men. It was like, and so in those spaces, they started to like just be upfront that like our race politics and queer politics, you cannot disentangle them. They are like, don't even try it. We will let you know that that's not going to work for us. And then I think in some ways the prevalence of queer leaders and student orgs collided with like the increasing awareness of intersectional identities in gay politics, plus pop culture, like RuPaul's Drag Race. I mean, like just witnessing more public queer plus brown, black things. It's sort of I have noticed a major shift among, and this is just anecdotal from like witnessing their socials, like queer issues are take precedent over racial issues. Like for a while it was queerness that it went from like ethnicity and race front and center to like queerness is front and center with like 2015, and then actually with the popular, like with the emergence of Black Lives Matter, I think there's another sort of shift going on in which they are trying to say like you can't be queer without addressing anti-Blackness. So it's a lot of interesting things happening.
It's a lot, and disability, populism. It's a lot. Well, thank you for answering that.
Yes.
All right, beautiful people. It is 1:35. Can we give one more applause for Dr. Anthony Ocampo? Yay!
And hi, friends. I see Helen, nice to see you, and other sociology friends.
Isn't it fun? I love
I'm stuck here with all the kids, but I'll email you later. I have some ideas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Helen.
Thank you for organizing this, Erin. I'm really, really thankful. So
this is my pleasure. This is beautiful and necessary, and we are grateful. So we will send out a thank you link and survey so you can see the recording. And please feel welcome to get in touch. This is great work, and we can't cover it all in an hour and a half.
So for sure.
Thank you again. Thank you again, Anthony. Thank you everyone for joining us. Wash your hands, stay safe. We'll see you in February with Orly Clerget from UC Davis.
Oh, yeah. I want to go to that. Okay.
Bye. You're invited.